All right. Hey, folks. So it's Faz here from Fazlifts. Today, the topic is intensity versus volume. Now, when I look for discussions on intensity versus volume, as a content creator, there are two things that I immediately notice. First one is that these topics tend to get a lot of hits, right? The second one is that the videos I see aren't always necessarily that helpful from a practical standpoint. So, what I aim to give to you today is some practical guidelines for how to adjust your relative intensity and your volume for better gains. Like from the perspective of a coach, what do I do when I see that someone's plateaued? How do I adjust the variables so that you know what to do with your own training? So let's get into it. So yeah, as I say, these discussions, they tend to get very theoretical. So I want to provide you with some practical guidelines. Now, give you a preemptive summary. So muscles grow in response to training stimulus. Now, if you're not growing, we can vary the relative intensity and the volume for best progress. So relative intensity basically means how hard you're working, okay? How close to failure, how much beyond failure, all that stuff. And volume is defined by the number of hard sets per body part, usually per week. Pushing either intensity or volume or a combination has pros and cons. Now, all of this assumes you have your rest and recovery and diet in check. Okay, so that's the preemptive summary. Let's dig into it. Firstly, R&R and diet. Make sure you're sleeping at least 7 hours. We know there's so much data on this. If you have impaired sleep, when you're gaining weight, more of that's going to be fat, less of it's going to be muscle. When you're losing weight, you're going to lose more muscle and less fat. So make sure your sleep is in check. Next thing is be in a surplus, a caloric surplus, if you're trying to gain. Now, I know at this point, people might argue back, well, you can gain muscle in a deficit. You can recomposition. Yes, I'm happy to say you can. But remember, this is about busting plateaus. So we're trying to give ourselves the best chance of success. And the best chance of success generally comes in a surplus. So if we're looking at things to fix, let's fix that first. And the final thing is to minimize stress. So if you've got all that perfect and you've got the perfect routine, but all of a sudden you're going through a divorce, your cat died, and God knows what else, then you have very little chance of gaining. So try and minimize stress. And that is external stress, but also self-imposed stress. So that's your first point of call. Next, and this is even before we touch intensity and volume, we have to look at these factors first. So firstly, can we just decide if you are plateaued or you're just burnt out on one exercise? Are the other exercises for that area going up? So a common one that I come across all the time is the bench press. Bench press will plateau and stall, but the dumbbell bench, the dips, even the overhead press, the tricep exercise will all be going up. So that usually happens because people are a lot more interested in the bench press. They often have it first in the routine. They've been doing that lift for the most consistent amount of time over the years, whereas all the rest of the things, they sort of substitute in and out. So in that case, you just replace the exercise. The bench press goes away for a while. You focus on something else. You might focus on dumbbell benches, a good machine press, whatever. And then we also want to decide, are you actually feeling quite sore and fatigued? So for example, if you have a selection of back exercises and your back just feels beat up all the time and you're not progressing on any back exercise, well, in that case, you're not going to add anything. You're actually going to take something away. And for a lot of people, they tend to overtrain on certain areas. So it's a case of, okay, let's pull back rather than add more. So if we can just get rid of all those factors, then we can go into how we vary intensity and volume. So this part of the discussion is now assuming your diet's in check, you're sleeping well, you're in a surplus, you're not burnt out on any one exercise, and you're not just doing too much and you're sore and beat up. So you're feeling fresh and you're ready to gain, but you just keep hitting a plateau. So for example, you might get up to a certain weight on a lift like the squat and you just can't go past it. You want to bust past the plateau. So first thing I would do is I want to initially check and push relative intensity to reasonably high levels first. What that means is ensure that you're training either close or to failure on the exercises that you're doing, whatever is safe to do, and make sure you're lifting with a certain degree of focused intensity. So that is intent and intensity. So good full range of motion and form reasonable cadence and rep speed. So intensity doesn't mean just lifting like an absolute ape. It means lifting with good form, but with the focus and aggression and intensity to maintain great form while pushing your body to the limit. It takes a lot to do that. Anyone could just attack the weights and lift like an ape, but to be able to lift correctly and still lift with aggression and intensity is a skill. So let's get that right first before we play with volume. So that's my first point of call. Firstly, make sure you are pushing the sets hard enough. If you're not doing that, we can't really class them as working sets. And that is one of the areas where the lifetime intermediate will fall down, because they'll say, okay, I'm doing 20 sets per body part because I'm right at the top of the volume threshold, because that's what I've heard is necessary for lots of gains. So they'll push 20 sets per body part and they'll get nothing. Like, I don't understand. I'm in a surplus. My volume is super high. I'm not gaining. Everything else is going great. And it's usually because they've programmed in so much work that they're not able to do it justice. So their intensity is rubbish. So none of the sets really count. So did you do 20 sets? Well, if they're not hard enough, you actually did nothing. You might have been in the gym moving some weight around, but actually it wasn't hard enough to cause any kind of growth stimulus. And people will get to that point. As a beginner, you can do pretty much anything and train pretty light, pretty easy, and pretty far away from failure and gain great. But at a certain point, you really have to push it. So let's get this right first before we play with volume. And yeah, for a lot of people, getting the intensity right will spur on a lot of gains. I mean, I'm not the massive fan of the whole 2-set to failure approach, a top set, back off set, but for a lot of people, it's what they need, because it raises their level of intensity up to a point where they don't need it as much as they thought. So anyway, we take care of that first, and then we move on to volume. So if you take care of all those factors and you're still not gaining, this is where we gradually add some volume. So this is defined by the number of hard sets per body part, usually per week. Now, a few things to bear in mind here. Firstly, individuals will have different volume tolerances for each body part. So for me, my biceps need a lot more volume than, say, my quads or my chest. Way more. So when I see somebody who is doing, say, 10 sets or 12 sets per body part per week at uniform across everything, that's when I start to worry, because it means they've not put attention into where they need to be adding volume. They've just looked at blanket headlines like, yep, 10 to 20 sets. You need to try and figure out your own individual volume tolerances if you're stalling. Like, yeah, if you're doing 10 sets per body part and you're gaining, great, you carry on. If you're doing 20 sets and you're gaining and you have no recovery issues, great, you carry on. But if you have a problem, that's when you need to start to learn to individualize. Second thing is, you will have a different volume tolerance to me. Okay, so this is why I rarely talk about my own volume tolerances, just because it's not really that helpful. People will need more, people will need less. Thirdly, you will have a different volume tolerance as a beginner to when you're an advanced lifter. It varies, it changes. As a rough general rule, beginners need very little. Intermediates generally need the most. And as an advanced lifter, the volume tolerance tends to come down again. I will explain why in a different video. It's a longer discussion. I have touched on it before in previous videos. And the final thing is, you will also have a different volume tolerance at 20 than you at 40. Again, not comparing you at 20 with me at 40, but you at 20 with you at 40. Your volume tolerance will change over the span of a lifetime. Part of that is because you get stronger. Part of that is because you get older. But don't try and compare yourself to other people, to drug users, to non-drug users. There's no formula. I know drug users who need a lot less volume or a lot more volume, and lateral guys who need more or less as well. So it doesn't, there's no comparison there. As much as people would like to believe it is to dumb things down. But you have to really focus on yourself, not on broad general guidelines. So putting this all together, let's give the example of, let's say your chest isn't responding to 8 sets per week. So first of all, here's what you do. You check your rest, make sure you're sleeping at least 7 hours. You check your stress levels, make sure you're focused on minimizing stress. Okay. And thirdly, you be in a surplus. Then raise intensity per set to the minimum standards that I gave earlier in the video. And finally, if you're still not gaining, raise volume by 1 or 2 hard sets per body part per week, evaluate it for 2 weeks, then adjust as necessary. It's really that simple. Like, it is this simple. So I really wanted to offer you guys some practical guidance for navigating through the whole intensity versus volume. And notice that all of this is centered around you as an individual, because that's what we do. That's what you have to do. I think all too often people look for headlines, say, okay, well, this guy says volume is the key. This guy says intensity is the key. So you jump from one to another. And I even see it in comments. Somebody will say, oh, I'm struggling with recovery. So Faz, what do you think about one set to failure? Why not just do a little bit less? Rather than jump to one extreme to another, why not find out what works for you? Whatever you're doing, and if you don't feel you're recovering, take a little bit away. Or let's say you are recovering and you want to do more, add a little bit. Why do we need to basically nut hug these YouTube celebrity influencers by saying, great, I'm just going to go all in for this guy who's a high volume guy, and then next month I'm going to go all in on this guy who's to failure? Why don't we try and figure out what's best for us? And that's what this video is about. What is best for you? So get on it. Let me know what you've decided, what you've learned from this video. Put it down below, and let's get some discussion going.